The year was 1904, and New York City was buzzing with change. Horse carriages shared the streets with the first automobiles, and tall buildings were reaching toward the sky. He worked in the textile business, buying and selling fabrics, and had built a good life for his family. Robert's mother, Ella, was an artist who loved to paint beautiful pictures. Their home on Riverside Drive was filled with paintings, books, and music. It was the kind of house where smart conversations happened every evening around the dinner table. He learned Latin and Greek so he could read ancient books in their original words. He studied French and German too. He was still a teenager. He became fascinated with Sanskrit, the ancient language of India. He wanted to read old Indian religious texts, especially the Bhagavad Gita, in the language they were written in. In this exciting time, on April 22nd, a baby boy was born who would one day change the world forever. The book talked about duty, right and wrong, and what happens when people have to make terrible decisions. In literature class, he wrote papers that showed deep understanding of poems and stories. He made friends who shared his love of learning and deep conversations. They would stay up late into the night talking about science, art, politics, and the meaning of life. Robert was often the center of these discussions, not because he tried to be, but because his ideas were so interesting and original. His love of learning, his deep thinking about difficult questions, and his ability to see connections between different ideas would all serve him well. He had a brilliant mind, a loving family, and endless possibilities ahead of him. He could not have known that in just 20 years. He would become the most famous scientist in America and help create a weapon that would change human history forever. For now, he was simply a young scholar eager to explore the mysteries of the universe and discover what secrets nature might reveal to him. But his tendency towards sadness and his habit of worrying about big problems would also follow him throughout his life. He could discuss the philosophy of ancient Greeks as easily as he could explain modern scientific theories. He graduated summa cum laude, which meant he was one of the very best students in his class. He knew he wanted to be a scientist, but he was not sure exactly what kind of scientist he wanted to be. He was interested in so many different things that it was hard to choose just one path. His professors all agreed that he was destined for great things in the world of science. Some even said he was the most brilliant student they had ever taught. It seemed like there was nothing Robert could not learn and master. He was brilliant, but he was also often sad and moody. When he talked about science or literature, his eyes would light up with excitement, and others would find themselves caught up in his enthusiasm. He had a way of making everyone around him feel smarter just by listening to him speak. He would spend long hours alone in his room, reading or thinking. Sometimes he seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, even though he was just a boy. His parents took him to doctors, but no one could explain why such a gifted child often seemed so troubled. Robert read it over and over again, not knowing that its words would one day come back to haunt him in a way he could never imagine. He would spend hours studying each stone, learning about how they were formed deep inside the earth. His grandfather gave him a small collection of minerals as a gift. Most children would have looked at them for a few minutes and then forgotten about them. He was only 16 years old, but he was already more educated than most college graduates. At Harvard, Robert threw himself into his studies with incredible energy. He took classes in chemistry, physics, literature, philosophy, and languages all at the same time. But Robert was fascinated. He spent days examining each rock under a magnifying glass, reading books about geology, and writing careful notes about what he discovered. This was the beginning of his lifelong love of science. His parents noticed that their son had an unusual mind. He asked questions that most adults could not answer, and he remembered everything he read or heard. His parents named him Julius Robert Oppenheimer, though everyone would later call him Robert or simply Oppie. Robert's father. Julius was a successful businessman who had come to America from Germany many years before. His teachers did not always know what to do with him. While other children struggled with simple math problems, Robert was reading books about advanced mathematics and science. He also loved literature and could recite long poems from memory. From the very beginning, Robert was different from other children. While most kids his age were playing with toys, Robert was collecting rocks and minerals. When Robert was just 8 years old, something wonderful happened. School was easy for Robert, almost too easy. He finished his homework quickly and then read books that were meant for much older students. But Robert was not just interested in science. He had a deep love for languages and literature that would stay with him his whole life. The Bhagavad Gita was a special book for Robert. It told the story of a warrior prince who had to make difficult choices about war and peace. As Robert grew older, his parents began to worry about him. Despite his moods, Robert had a special charm that drew people to him. He could make difficult ideas sound simple and interesting. When it came time for college, there was no question that Robert would go to Harvard University. His professors were amazed by him. In chemistry class, he could understand complex reactions that took other students weeks to learn. But college was not just about studying for Robert. Robert finished his degree at Harvard in just 3 years instead of the usual 4. As Robert prepared to leave Harvard and continue his education, he was excited about the future, but also somewhat uncertain. Looking back, it is clear that these early years shaped everything that would come later in Robert's life. The young man who left Harvard in 1925 was ready to take on the world. Robert Oppenheimer's journey from curious child to world-changing scientist was just beginning. After leaving Harvard in 1925, Robert Oppenheimer faced a choice that would shape his entire future. He had graduated with highest honors, but now he needed to decide what kind of scientist he wanted to become. His professors encouraged him to continue his studies in Europe, where some of the greatest scientific minds in history were making amazing discoveries about the nature of atoms and energy. He was excited to work with J.J. Thomson, a brilliant scientist who had discovered the electron just a few decades earlier. Robert thought this would be the perfect place to begin his career as a physicist. However, things did not go as he had hoped. Robert decided to go to Cambridge University in England, one of the most famous schools in the world. An idea is not when he was trying to make physical things work with his hands. They called their new science quantum mechanics. And it was completely different from the old physics that people had studied for hundreds of years. These scientists were not just doing experiments in laboratories. They were using pure mathematics and abstract thinking to understand the deepest secrets of nature. He left Cambridge and traveled to the University of Göttingen in Germany. There he met Max Born, a kind and brilliant scientist who became like a father to him. He was simply in the wrong kind of science before. Quantum mechanics was perfect for his type of mind. While other students struggled to understand the strange new mathematics, Robert seemed to grasp the ideas almost instantly. He could solve problems that left others confused for weeks. Born immediately recognized Robert's special gifts and welcomed him into a group of the most talented young physicists in the world. Werner Heisenberg, who would later win the Nobel Prize, was just a few years older than Robert. Wolfgang Pauli, known for his sharp wit and brilliant insights, became one of Robert's close friends. They would take long walks through the German countryside discussing the mysteries of atoms and the nature of reality itself. Robert loved these conversations because they combined his interests in science, philosophy, and the big questions about existence. Paul Dirac, a quiet Englishman with an amazing mathematical mind, was also part of this incredible group. He wrote scientific papers about the behavior of molecules and atoms that showed real creativity and insight. His work was so good that other scientists began to pay attention to this young American who had seemed to appear out of nowhere. His dissertation was about the quantum mechanical behavior of molecules, and it was considered brilliant by his professors. But more importantly, Robert had found his calling. He now knew that he was meant to be a theoretical physicist, someone who uses mathematics and abstract thinking to understand the fundamental laws of nature. But at Cambridge, practical laboratory work was considered the most important part of being a physicist. He had big plans to create the first world-class school of theoretical physics in America. He wanted to train a new generation of American scientists who could compete with the best minds in Europe. Little did he know that the skills and knowledge he had gained would soon be needed for something far more important than just advancing scientific understanding. He had offers from several American universities who wanted to hire this brilliant young physicist. After much consideration, he decided to accept positions at both the University of California at Berkeley and the California Institute of Technology. He was no longer the uncertain student trying to figure out his place in the world. He was now Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, one of the most promising young theoretical physicists in the country. His European training had given him knowledge and skills that few American scientists possessed. He would spend part of each year at each school, teaching and doing research. He was far from home, struggling with work that felt impossible, and beginning to doubt whether he had any talent for science at all. He worked briefly in Switzerland and Holland, learning from more masters of the new quantum mechanics. Each experience added to his knowledge and confidence. The shy, depressed young man who had struggled at Cambridge was becoming a confident and accomplished scientist. His famous charm and confidence seemed to disappear. He wrote sad letters to his friends back in America, telling them he was thinking about giving up physics entirely. Some of his friends became so worried about him that they urged him to come home. Robert began to feel like he had made a terrible mistake. The university was filled with brilliant young scientists from all over Europe and America. They would gather in cafes and lecture halls to discuss their latest discoveries. Robert found himself surrounded by people who shared his love of deep thinking and complex ideas. For the first time in his life, he felt like he truly belonged somewhere. At Cambridge, Robert struggled terribly. Thomson put him to work in the laboratory, doing experiments with glass tubes, wires, and electrical equipment. But Robert's hands were not as clever as his mind. He was clumsy with the delicate instruments, and his experiments often failed. Glass tubes would break in his hands, and electrical circuits would not work properly when he built them. Other students seemed to have a natural talent for laboratory work, but Robert felt lost and frustrated. The problem was that Robert was a theoretical thinker. His mind worked best when he was solving problems with mathematics. As weeks passed, Robert became more and more depressed. But then something changed Robert's life forever. He heard about amazing work being done in Germany by a group of scientists who were developing new ideas about atoms and energy. In 1926, Robert made a decision that would change everything. At Göttingen, Robert discovered that he was not a failure as a scientist. The atmosphere at Göttingen was unlike anything Robert had ever experienced. Some of the most famous names in science were working at Göttingen during this time. These young scientists were not just colleagues. They became lifelong friends who would shape each other's careers for decades to come. Under Max Born's guidance, Robert began to do original research that impressed everyone around him. In 1927, Robert completed his doctoral degree at Göttingen. After finishing his degree, Robert spent time studying with other great scientists in Europe. In 1929, Robert returned to America as a completely different person than the one who had left 4 years earlier. Robert's return to America marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. The young man who came back from Europe was ready to build something great. Robert's wandering years were over. Now it was time to put his brilliant mind to work. The 1930s were both wonderful and terrible years for Robert Oppenheimer. At Berkeley and Caltech, he was building exactly what he had dreamed of creating. American students were coming from all over the country to study with him, and he was training the best young physicists in America. His lectures were famous for being both brilliant and beautiful. He would explain the most difficult ideas about atoms and energy in ways that made them seem like poetry. Robert lived like a true scholar during these years. He had a beautiful apartment filled with books in many languages. He loved to host dinner parties where scientists, artists, and writers would gather to discuss everything from quantum mechanics to ancient philosophy. His students adored him because he treated them like equals and encouraged them to think big thoughts about the universe. And she was a beautiful and intelligent woman who was studying to become a psychiatrist. Jean was passionate about politics and fighting injustice. She opened Robert's eyes to the suffering of ordinary people and made him think about how scientists could use their knowledge to make the world better. In 1938, German scientists split an atom of uranium for the first time. This process, called nuclear fission, released enormous amounts of energy from a tiny piece of matter. Scientists around the world immediately understood what this meant. If someone could control this process, they could build weapons more powerful than anything that had ever existed. Their relationship was intense, but troubled. Partly because Jean struggled with depression, and partly because they both had strong personalities that sometimes clashed. They brought with them terrible stories of what was happening in Germany. Was so worried about this discovery that he wrote a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt in 1939. Einstein warned the president that Germany might try to build atomic bombs, and that America needed to start its own atomic research immediately. Roosevelt read the letter and authorized the first small steps toward what would become the Manhattan Project. They chose General Leslie Groves to lead what they called the Manhattan Project. Groves was a tough, practical man who had just finished building the Pentagon, the largest office building in the world. He needed to do this in complete secrecy. While America was fighting a war on two sides of the world, most difficult of all, he needed to find someone who could lead all the brilliant scientists who would work on the project. He was not a scientist, but he knew how to get big, complicated projects done quickly. They suggested men who had won Nobel Prizes and led big laboratories for many years. But Groves had different ideas. He had heard about a young professor at Berkeley who was brilliant. Charming, he could inspire people to work harder than they thought possible. Most importantly, he could see the big picture of what the Manhattan Project was trying to accomplish, while also understanding all the technical details. He chose Robert Oppenheimer to be the scientific director of the Manhattan Project. Robert would be responsible for bringing together the greatest collection of scientific talent in human history and using it to build weapons that could end the war. He was giving up his peaceful life as a professor to take on a responsibility that was almost too big to imagine. If he succeeded, he might help America and its allies win the war and save democracy. If he failed, Hitler might get atomic bombs first, and the world would fall into darkness. Groves was a career military officer who believed in following orders and getting things done efficiently. Robert was an intellectual who loved literature and philosophy as much as physics. Groves was practical and direct. Robert was complicated and sometimes moody, yet somehow these two very different men understood each other, and somehow able to get geniusly vile scientists to work together as a team. Universities were being destroyed, books were being burned, and Jewish scientists were losing their jobs or worse. Robert felt deep sadness and anger as he watched his friends suffer and saw the country that had given him so much turn into something evil. But while Robert was enjoying his life as a professor, dark clouds were gathering over the world. In Europe, Adolf Hitler was rising to power in Germany, and everything changed on December 7, 1941. Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor, killing thousands of American sailors and soldiers. America was suddenly at war, and the atomic bomb project became urgent. But now there was no choice. America was fighting for its life against enemies who seemed willing to do anything to win. Robert knew that his comfortable life as a university professor was about to end. During the Great Depression, he saw poor people struggling to find work and food. He attended meetings where people discussed how to make society more fair and just. Some of his friends were communists who believed that only a complete change in government could solve the world's problems. Robert never became a communist himself, but he sympathized with their goals of helping working people and fighting against fascism. The same country where Robert had learned quantum mechanics was now becoming a place of hatred and violence. Many of the brilliant scientists Robert had worked with in Germany were forced to flee their homeland because they were Jewish or because they opposed Hitler's government. Some of Robert's former colleagues began arriving in America as refugees. At the same time, Robert was becoming more interested in politics and social issues. Robert also fell deeply in love during this time. Her name was Jean Tatlock. Meanwhile, in Europe, scientists were making a discovery that would change everything. Albert Einstein, the most famous scientist in the world, at first, the American atomic research moved slowly. Scientists at universities across the country began studying nuclear fission. But there was no clear plan, and not enough money. The attack on Pearl Harbor shocked Robert deeply. Like most Americans, he had hoped that his country could stay out of the terrible war that was destroying Europe and Asia. In 1942, the American government decided to put the atomic bomb project under military control. Groves faced an enormous challenge. He needed to bring together thousands of scientists, engineers, and workers to build weapons based on scientific theories that had never been tested. Many people told Groves to choose an older, more experienced scientist as his scientific director. When Groves first met Robert Oppenheimer, many people thought it was a strange match. Groves saw that Robert had something special. He could take the most difficult scientific ideas and explain them clearly to people who were not scientists. In the summer of 1942, Groves made one of the most important decisions of World War II. Robert accepted the job, knowing that it would change his life forever. The scholar was about to become a leader. The man who loved poetry was about to help create the most destructive weapons ever made. In late 1942, Robert Oppenheimer found himself driving through the high desert of New Mexico with General Groves, looking for a place to build the most important laboratory in human history. They needed somewhere remote enough to keep the work secret. but accessible enough for thousands of scientists and workers to live and work. As they drove up a winding mountain road, Robert remembered a place from his youth, where he had gone horseback riding and camping. It sat on a beautiful mesa, a flat-topped mountain about 7,300 feet above sea level. From there, you could see 4 miles across the New Mexican desert to distant mountain ranges. There was a small boys' school on the mesa, but otherwise it was empty wilderness. Robert looked out across the vast landscape and told Groves that this was the perfect place. The place was called Los Alamos, which means the cottonwoods in Spanish. Construction workers arrived first, building roads, laboratories, offices, and hundreds of small houses for the families who would live there. Everything had to be built from scratch, because there was nothing on the mesa except the old school buildings. He was also a deep thinker who worried constantly about the moral implications of the work they were doing. Robert and Bohr would take long walks around Los Alamos, discussing not just the technical problems of building atomic bombs, but also what it would mean for humanity if they succeeded. Robert had the incredible job of recruiting the best physicists, mathematicians, chemists, and engineers from all over America and Europe. He needed to convince them to leave their comfortable university jobs and move to a place that did not officially exist. To work on a project so secret he could not even tell them what they would be doing. Their wives and children came too, creating a strange community in the middle of nowhere. The wives had to give up their own careers and interests to follow their husbands to this secret place. She was an intelligent woman who had been married before and was used to an independent life. But at Los Alamos, she felt trapped and isolated. She began drinking too much, and her relationship with Robert became strained. They needed to figure out exactly how to make uranium and plutonium explode with the maximum possible force. They held meetings late into the night, discussing different approaches to the technical problems they faced. Robert was at the center of all these discussions, somehow keeping track of dozens of different search projects, while also managing the personalities and egos of some of the most brilliant people in the world. They had to design complicated mechanisms that would work perfectly the first time they were used, because there would be no second chance. Every calculation had to be exactly right, because even small mistakes could mean the difference between success and failure. The scientists knew they were working on something that could change history. They felt like they were racing against time, trying to build atomic weapons before German scientists could do the same thing. Many of them had fled from Nazi-controlled Europe, and they were determined to help defeat fascism. The pressure of his job and the secrecy surrounding their work made it hard for them to talk to each other about what was really happening in their lives. The theoretical problems were being solved, and the engineering challenges were being overcome one by one. Robert could see that they were getting close to actually building working atomic bombs. But he was also beginning to understand the awesome power of what they were creating. World-famous scientists lived next door to young graduate students. Nobel Prize winners ate lunch with technicians and engineers. Children played in the dirt roads while their parents worked on the most advanced physics problems ever attempted. Everyone who lived there was part of a great secret that they could not share with anyone on the outside. Many of them were highly educated women who found themselves stuck in a small town with nothing to do except take care of their families and try to figure out what their husbands were working on. Water had to be piped up from the valley below, and telephone lines had to be strung across miles of desert. Within months, Los Alamos was transformed from a quiet mountain retreat into a bustling secret city. He would look up at the stars in the clear desert sky and think about what they were doing in this secret city. He knew that if they succeeded, the world would never be the same again. The quiet professor who had once read Sanskrit poetry was about to help unleash forces that had been locked inside atoms since the beginning of time. But the real transformation began when the scientists started arriving in 1943. Fermi was a quiet, gentle Italian who was already famous for his work with radioactivity. Natural uranium was not pure enough to make a weapon. Scientists at other secret facilities around the country were working to create highly enriched uranium and plutonium. But the processes were slow and expensive. At Los Alamos, Robert and his team had to design weapons that would work with whatever materials they could get. He was so brilliant that other scientists called him the Pope because they believed everything he said about physics. Hans Bethe arrived from Cornell University, a German refugee who could solve almost any mathematical problem put in front of him. Edward Teller came from George Washington University. a passionate Hungarian who talked constantly about building even bigger and more powerful bombs. Somehow, Robert managed to attract an amazing collection of talent. Enrico Fermi came from the University of Chicago. Perhaps most importantly, Niels Bohr arrived from Denmark. Bohr was one of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics and had won the Nobel Prize years earlier. The scientists were not the only ones who came to Los Alamos. Robart's own wife, Kitty, struggled particularly hard with life at Los Alamos. The work itself was incredibly difficult and often frustrating. The scientists were trying to solve problems that had never been solved before. One of the biggest challenges was creating enough of the special materials needed for the bombs. The scientists worked long hours, often 7 days a week. Despite the pressure and secrecy, there was also a sense of excitement and purpose at Los Alamos. The community at Los Alamos was like nothing that had ever existed before. As 1944 turned into 1945, the work at Los Alamos was reaching a critical point. Late at night, when the laboratories were quiet and most people were asleep, Robert would sometimes walk alone around the mesa. The race to build the atomic bomb was almost over, and Los Alamos was about to change the world forever. By the summer of 1945, Robert Oppenheimer was barely sleeping. For weeks, he had been chain-smoking cigarettes and losing weight as the most important test in human history approached. Everything that thousands of scientists had worked on for 3 years would come down to a single moment in the New Mexican desert. It was a perfect name for what was about to happen. The site was in the Alamogordo Desert, about 200 miles south of Los Alamos. They built a 100-foot steel tower in the middle of the desert and placed their atomic device, nicknamed the Gadget, at the top. The bomb was not beautiful to look at. It was a fat, round metal ball covered with cables and detonators. Scientists at Los Alamos had figured out that if they could squeeze a ball of plutonium very quickly and evenly from all sides, the atoms would start a chain reaction that would release incredible amounts of energy in a tiny fraction of a second. But the squeezing had to be perfect. If the explosives around the plutonium did not fire at exactly the same time, the bomb would not work. Summer thunderstorms were common in the New Mexican desert, and lightning could set off the bomb accidentally. High winds could spread radioactive material in dangerous directions. Robert found himself staring at the sky constantly, hoping for calm conditions on the morning they had chosen for the test. The Manhattan Project had cost over $2 billion, more money than had ever been spent on a single scientific project. If Trinity failed, Groves would have to explain to President Truman and Congress why they had spent so much money on nothing. Worse, if the war continued much longer without atomic weapons, many more American soldiers would die invading Japan. Inside this ugly shell was the most concentrated power that humans had ever created. Everything seemed to be working properly. The weather forecast looked good for early morning. He set the test time for 5:30 a.m. when it would still be dark, but the winds would be calm. He walked around the camp, checking with different groups of scientists and technicians. Everyone was tense and excited. They knew they were about to witness something that no human being had ever seen before. At exactly 5 hours 29 minutes and 45 seconds a.m., the countdown reached 0. And someone pressed the button that fired the detonators, set up radio communications so that everyone could coordinate their actions. Even though Robert was lying face down with his eyes closed and wearing dark glasses, the flash was so bright that he could see the bones in his hands through his closed eyelids. A wave of incredible warmth washed over everyone at the observation site, even though they were 10 miles away from the explosion. The heat was so intense that some people thought their clothes might catch fire. The light lasted for several seconds, turning night into day across hundreds of square miles. He even arranged for eye protection, special dark glasses that would prevent people from being blinded by the flash. Others worried that it might work too well. There were even a few who feared that the atomic explosion might set the entire atmosphere on fire, destroying all life on Earth. Robert knew these extreme fears were probably wrong, but the uncertainty kept him awake at night. A tremendous roar rolled across the desert, followed by a shockwave that shook the ground like an earthquake. Robert felt the earth tremble beneath him and knew that they had unleashed something beyond human understanding. A gigantic mushroom-shaped cloud was rising into the sky, climbing higher and higher until it reached 40,000 feet above the desert. The cloud was filled with colors that seemed to shift and change as it rose. It was both beautiful and terrifying. Within weeks, similar weapons would be used against Japan, and the war would end. But Robert Oppenheimer, the man who had made it all possible, felt like he was carrying the weight of the future on his shoulders. It was flat, empty land where no one lived, surrounded by mountains that would help contain the blast. If something went wrong, at least the damage would be limited to this desolate place. The knowledge they had gained could never be forgotten, and the power they had unleashed could never be put back into the box. They called the test Trinity, and it would determine whether the atomic bomb was real or just an expensive dream. As he watched the mushroom cloud climbing into the morning sky, words from the ancient Sanskrit text he had loved since youth came into his mind. It was a verse from the Bhagavad Gita, where the god Vishnu reveals his terrible power to the warrior Arjuna. He set up his headquarters in an old ranch house, about 10 miles from the tower. Scientists and military officers came and went constantly, checking instruments, making final adjustments, and trying to predict what would happen when they pressed the button that would change the world. The location chosen for Trinity was a place called Jornada del Muerto, which means Journey of Death in Spanish. Robert and his team had been preparing for Trinity for months, as the gadget used plutonium, one of the rarest and most dangerous substances on Earth. In the days before the test, Robert barely left the test site, as the weather became a constant worry. General Groves was also nervous, though he tried not to show it. As July 16th approached, Robert made final preparations. He positioned observers at different distances from the blast site to measure the explosion and take photographs.
Ow!
But no one really knew what to expect. Some scientists thought the bomb might not work at all. On the evening of July 15th, Robert and his team made their final checks of the gadget. Robert spent the night at base camp, 10 miles from the explosion site. He tried to rest, but sleep was impossible. As 5:30 a.m. approached, Robert lay flat on the ground with the other observers, facing away from the tower. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the desert was filled with a light brighter than the sun. Then came the heat. After the light and heat came the sound. When it was safe to look, Robert and the others turned toward the explosion site. Some of the scientists cheered and celebrated. They had done it. They had split the atom and released its power. But Robert felt no joy. The words that came to Robert were, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." Robert understood in that moment that everything had changed. The age of atomic weapons had begun, and there was no way to go back. The Trinity test was a complete success. The bomb had worked even better than they had hoped. The destroyer of worlds had been born in the New Mexican desert, and Robert knew that humanity would never be the same. 3 weeks after Trinity, Robert Oppenheimer was sitting in his office at Los Alamos when the news came. It was August 6, 1945, and President Truman had just authorized the use of the atomic bomb on Japan. The target was a city called Hiroshima. The bomb they dropped was different from the Trinity device. Part of him was relieved that their work had finally been put to use and that the war might soon be over. American soldiers would not have to invade Japan, which would have cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. But another part of him was horrified by what had just happened to the people of Hiroshima. But it was based on the same terrible science that Robert and his team had developed. Robert felt a mix of emotions that he could not fully understand. As the scientific leader of the Manhattan Project, he was more responsible than anyone else for the atomic bombs. During a gathering at Los Alamos after Japan's surrender, Robert stood before his colleagues and spoke words that would be remembered forever. Newspapers and magazines called him the father of the atomic bomb. His photograph appeared on the cover of major magazines, and everyone wanted to hear his story. The shy professor, who had once preferred to stay in his laboratory, was suddenly the most famous scientist in America. He said that the atomic bomb had put scientists in a position to know sin, and that this knowledge was something they could never give back. The reports from Japan were devastating. The bomb had destroyed most of the city in an instant. Tens of thousands of people had been killed immediately, and many more were dying from burns and radiation sickness. Entire families had been wiped out. Buildings had been turned to ash and rubble. Everywhere he went, people wanted to talk about the atomic bomb. Every newspaper article about nuclear weapons mentioned his name. He had become forever linked with the most destructive weapons in human history, and there was no way to change that. He advised President Truman and other government officials about atomic policy. He argued that the United States should share atomic technology with other countries through international organizations. so that no single nation would have too much power. He believed that openness and cooperation were the only ways to prevent the atomic bomb from destroying civilization. The weapon that Robert had helped create had done exactly what it was designed to do, but seeing its effects on real people was almost too much to bear. Politicians worried that sharing atomic technology would help America's enemies. Some people even began to question whether Robert could be trusted with sensitive information about national security. Everyone wanted to know what he thought about the future of atomic energy and whether atomic weapons could be controlled. He was still famous and influential, but he was also increasingly controversial. Some people saw him as a wise voice calling for nuclear sanity. Others saw him as a dangerous idealist who did not understand the realities of international politics. Robert tried to use his fame to promote the peaceful uses of atomic energy and to warn about the dangers of a nuclear arms race. He was proud of the scientific achievement that the Manhattan Project represented, but he was also horrified by the human cost of atomic weapons. They were collecting evidence about his past political activities and his current policy positions. They were planning to use his own words and actions against him in a way that would end his influence forever. The weight of being Prometheus, the one who had stolen fire from the gods, was becoming too much for any human being to bear. We wanted to prevent nuclear war, but he also believed that America needed to stay ahead of other countries in atomic technology. He supported the peaceful uses of atomic energy, but he worried about what would happen if atomic materials fell into the wrong hands. Scientists wanted international control of atomic energy. The military wanted bigger and better bombs. Politicians wanted to use atomic weapons as tools of diplomacy. Everyone claimed to have the best interests of the country at heart, but they could not agree on what those interests were. Robert was haunted by memories of Jean Tatlock, the woman he had loved before marrying Kitty. Jean had killed herself in 1944, and Robert blamed himself for not being there to help her through her depression. 3 days later, another atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Agents followed him wherever he went, opened his mail, and listened to his phone calls. They were particularly interested in his political activities from the 1930s, when he had attended meetings and donated money to causes that supported the poor and opposed fascism. What had seemed like innocent political involvement before the war now looked suspicious to government investigators. This one used plutonium, just like the Trinity device. Again, a city was destroyed and thousands of people died. Some people celebrated because the terrible war was finished and their friends and family members would be coming home. But many of the scientists felt deeply troubled about what their work had accomplished. They had started the Manhattan Project to defeat Nazi Germany, but Germany had already surrendered before the bombs were ready. Now their weapons had been used against Japan, and entire cities full of innocent people had been destroyed. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced that Japan was surrendering. World War II was finally over. At Los Alamos, the reaction to Japan's surrender was complicated. Robert found himself at the center of these difficult feelings. But even as Robert struggled with guilt and moral questions, the outside world was treating him like a hero. The attention was both exciting and overwhelming. Robert found himself invited to give speeches at universities, to advise government officials, and to appear on radio shows. But fame came with a price that Robert had not expected. The FBI began watching him constantly. Robert's personal life was also falling apart. His marriage to Kitty was troubled, partly because of the stress of his work, and partly because they both drank too much. The worst part of Robert's new life was that he could not escape from what he had done. Robert tried to find meaning in his situation by working to prevent nuclear war. But many people disagreed with Robert's ideas. Military leaders wanted to keep America's atomic secrets and build more powerful weapons. As the months passed after the war, Robert found himself caught between different groups with different ideas about atomic weapons. Robert's own views were complicated and sometimes contradictory. By 1949, Robert was exhausted from trying to balance all these competing pressures. What Robert did not know was that his enemies in the government were preparing to destroy him. The man who had helped America win the war was about to become a victim of the fear and suspicion that followed it. In September 1949, Robert Oppenheimer received news that would change his life forever. American spy planes had detected radioactive particles in the atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean. Scientists analyzed these particles and reached a shocking conclusion. The Soviet Union had successfully tested its first atomic bomb. Government officials had believed that it would take the Russians at least 10 years to build atomic weapons. Oh, they had done it in just 4 years. Fear swept through Washington as politicians and military leaders realized that American cities could soon be targets of Soviet nuclear attack. America's nuclear monopoly was over, and the Cold War arms race had officially begun. Edward Teller, Robert's former colleague from Los Alamos, had been pushing for years to develop a hydrogen bomb. This new weapon would be based on nuclear fusion instead of nuclear fission, and it could be thousands of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. Teller argued that America needed the hydrogen bomb to stay ahead of the Soviet Union. Politicians worried about appearing weak against the Soviet threat. Some people began to question whether Robert's opposition came from loyalty to America or sympathy for America's enemies. Strauss had never liked Robert, partly because Robert had embarrassed him in public meetings by correcting his scientific statements. Strauss was also suspicious of Robert's past political activities and his current opposition to new weapons programs. He had always known that other countries would eventually learn to build atomic weapons. The laws of physics were the same everywhere in the world. But as an American, he was deeply worried about what this meant for his country and for world peace. He had proven his patriotism by leading the Manhattan Project and helping win World War II. But in the paranoid atmosphere of the early 1950s, any connection to communist ideas or people was seen as dangerous. Robert's enemies began collecting evidence about his past, looking for ways to destroy his influence. In the 1930s, he had donated money to causes that supported the poor and opposed fascism. Some of these organizations had included communists among their members. The hearing was supposed to be secret, but details quickly leaked to the newspapers. Robert found himself on trial not just for his political views, but for his character and loyalty. They asked about his political donations, his relationships with suspected communists, and his opposition to the hydrogen bomb. They brought in former friends and colleagues to testify about conversations from years earlier. Edward Teller, who had worked with Robert at Los Alamos, testified that he no longer trusted Robert's judgment. Other colleagues gave damaging testimony about Robert's past statements and actions. Robert felt betrayed by people he had considered close friends. Some people supported Robert, but others were afraid to defend him because they worried about their own careers. His former girlfriend Jean Tatlock had been involved with communist groups. His brother Frank had actually been a member of the Communist Party for a short time. They argued that Robert was being punished not for disloyalty, but for having opinions that disagreed with government policy. But their protests could not undo the damage that had been done. He would spend his remaining years trying to rebuild his life and reputation, always carrying the burden of what he had created and what had been taken away from him. He admitted to lying to security officials in the past about contacts with Soviet agents, though he claimed he had done so to protect innocent friends. The father of the atomic bomb had been cast out by the very government he had served so faithfully. His crime was not betraying his country, but questioning whether bigger and more destructive weapons would make the world safer. He tried to explain his complex political views, but his explanations sometimes made him sound more suspicious rather than less. The panel was packed with Robert's enemies, and the political atmosphere made it impossible for him to receive a fair judgment. On June 29, 1954, the Atomic Energy Commission voted to revoke Robert's security clearance permanently. The official reason was that his past associations and current opposition to weapons programs made him a security risk. He could no longer participate in nuclear policy decisions or access classified information. The man who had been the most important scientist in America just 9 years earlier was now treated as a potential traitor. The fall from grace was complete and devastating. McCarthyism, as it came to be called, destroyed the careers and lives of thousands of innocent people who were accused of being disloyal to America. The atmosphere in Washington became poisonous, with people afraid to express any opinion that might be seen as unpatriotic. The Soviet bomb came as a terrible surprise to most Americans. Robert felt a complex mix of emotions about the Soviet bomb. As a scientist, he was not entirely surprised. He argued that the United States already had enough atomic bombs to destroy any enemy, and that building bigger weapons would just encourage other countries to do the same. In meetings with government officials, Robert spoke passionately against what he called a weapon of genocide. The letter claimed that Robert might be a Soviet spy or sympathizer. Eisenhower, who did not know Robert personally, decided to suspend his security clearance until a formal investigation could be conducted. This meant that Robert could no longer participate in secret government meetings or advise on nuclear policy. The Soviet atomic test immediately led to calls for America to build even more powerful weapons. Robert strongly opposed the hydrogen bomb project. He believed that such weapons were unnecessary for America's defense and would only make nuclear war more likely. But Robert's opposition to the hydrogen bomb made him powerful enemies. Military leaders believed that bigger weapons meant better security. The most dangerous of Robert's enemies was Louis Strauss, a wealthy businessman who had become chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. Throughout the early 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy was leading a campaign to find communist spies and sympathizers in the American government. Robert tried to stay above the political fighting, but his past made him vulnerable. None of this meant that Robert was disloyal to America. In 1953, President Eisenhower received a letter accusing Robert of being a security risk. The investigation took the form of a security hearing that began in April 1954. For 4 weeks, Robert was forced to defend his entire life before a panel of government officials. The hearing was devastating for Robert. Government lawyers questioned him about every aspect of his past. The most painful part of the hearing was watching former friends turn against him. Robert's own testimony was sometimes confused and contradictory. The stress of the hearing and years of attacks had worn him down. The outcome of the hearing was never really in doubt. The decision destroyed Robert's career as a government advisor. Robert's supporters were outraged by the decision. Many scientists believed that the hearing had been unfair and politically motivated. The security hearing marked the end of Robert Oppenheimer's influence in American nuclear policy. Robert left Washington in disgrace, but he was not broken. After the devastating security hearing of 1954, Robert Oppenheimer found himself in a strange new world. The man who had once advised presidents and shaped America's nuclear policy was now treated like a dangerous outsider. Government cars no longer came to pick him up for secret meetings. His phone stopped ringing with calls from Washington officials. The corridors of power that had once welcomed him were now closed forever. Here, there were no security guards checking identification or classified documents locked in safes. Professors and students could discuss any ideas they wanted without fear of being called disloyal. For more than a decade, he had been at the center of the most important decisions affecting America's future. Now, he was just another professor, albeit a famous one. Some days he felt relieved to be free from the burden of nuclear policy. Other days he felt lost and useless. For the first time in years, Robert could speak freely about the subjects that mattered most to him. He gave lectures on physics that drew packed audiences from around the world. Students and fellow professors were amazed by his ability to explain the most complex scientific ideas in clear, beautiful language. He had not lost his gift for making difficult concepts seem simple and fascinating. But Robert was not completely destroyed. The experience of creating the atomic bomb and then being cast out by his own government had made him think deeply about the relationship between science and society. He began giving speeches and writing articles about the moral responsibilities of scientists and the dangers of nuclear weapons. Now he spoke about ethics, philosophy, and the human consequences of scientific discovery. He warned that scientists could no longer pretend that their work had no connection to politics and morality. In it, he wrote about the need for openness and honesty in both science and politics. He argued that secrets and suspicion were dangerous to democracy, and that free discussion of ideas was essential for progress. In Europe, he was welcomed as a hero of science rather than treated as a security risk. British, French, and German scientists invited him to speak at their institutions and awarded him honorary degrees. These experiences reminded Robert that his reputation extended far beyond America's borders. Many readers saw the book as Robert's response to the secrecy and paranoia that had destroyed his government career. The atomic bomb had shown that scientific knowledge could be used for terrible purposes, and scientists had a duty to think about the implications of their research. Now he could visit the places where he had studied as a young man and reconnect with old friends from his early career. He returned to Cambridge and Göttingen, the universities where he had learned to be a physicist. These visits helped him remember who he had been before he became famous as the father of the atomic bomb. Years of heavy smoking had damaged his lungs, and the stress of his public life had taken its toll on his body. But his mind remained sharp, and he continued to write and speak about the issues that mattered to him. Young physicists and engineers were beginning to question whether they should work on weapons projects or whether they had obligations to consider the social consequences of their research. Robert tried to guide them, sharing the wisdom he had gained from his own difficult experiences. He watched with concern as America and the Soviet Union built larger and more dangerous nuclear weapons, exactly as he had predicted and feared. Free from the constraints of security clearances and political pressure, Robert could finally speak his mind about the most important issues of his time. He used his remaining years to warn humanity about the dangers of nuclear war and to challenge scientists to think carefully about their moral responsibilities. His name appeared in history books and magazine articles about World War II. Young people who learned about the atomic bomb in school often wrote him letters asking about his experiences. He remained forever linked to one of the most important and controversial events in human history. The hysteria of the McCarthy era was fading, and many Americans were starting to question whether the security hearing had been fair. He returned to reading Sanskrit texts and studying Hindu philosophy. He spent hours in his garden, growing vegetables and flowers. He read novels, attended concerts, and had long conversations with friends about art and literature. Prominent scientists, writers, and politicians began speaking out in Robert's defense. They argued that he had been punished not for disloyalty, but for having opinions that disagreed with government policy. He still had his position as director of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University, one of the most prestigious academic institutions in the world. This beautiful campus had been home to Albert Einstein during his final years, and now it would become Robert's refuge from the political storms that had consumed his life. His marriage to Kitty, which had been strained by years of stress and secrecy, slowly started to heal. They could finally talk openly about what had happened to them during the Manhattan Project and the security hearing. They had grown up in a world where nuclear weapons existed, and they wanted guidance about how to use their knowledge responsibly. Robert became a kind of conscience for the scientific community, reminding them that with great knowledge came great responsibility. Their children, Peter and Tony, were growing up and beginning to understand what their father had accomplished and what he had suffered. Princeton was different from Los Alamos, or the government offices in Washington. The transition was not easy. Robert had to learn how to live without the constant pressure and excitement of government service. Robert's family life also began to improve during these years. At Princeton, Robert threw himself into teaching and writing with the same intensity he had once brought to building atomic bombs. But Robert was no longer just interested in pure science. His talks were very different from the technical presentations Robert had given during his early career. Robert's message resonated with many people, especially younger scientists who were beginning their careers during the Cold War. As the years passed, public opinion about Robert began to change. In 1957, Robert published a book of essays called The Open Mind that became a bestseller. Robert also began traveling around the world, giving lectures and receiving honors from foreign universities. The travel was important for Robert's emotional healing. For years, he had been trapped in America, unable to leave the country because of security restrictions. During his years at Princeton, Robert also found time to pursue interests that had been pushed aside during the intense years of the Manhattan Project. But Robert could never completely escape from his past. Reporters still called him for comments whenever there was news about nuclear weapons. As the 1960s began, Robert's health started to decline. Robert also witnessed the emergence of a new generation of scientists who were asking the same moral questions that had troubled him since Trinity. The exile from government service that had seemed like such a disaster in 1954 had become, in many ways, a liberation. The man who had once been called the destroyer of worlds was now trying to save it from the very weapons he had helped create. On February 18, 1967, J. Robert Oppenheimer died peacefully at his home in Princeton, New Jersey. He was 62 years old, and his body had been ravaged by throat cancer, a disease likely caused by the chain-smoking habit that had followed him since his youth. As news of his death spread around the world, people everywhere tried to understand what his life had meant and what kind of legacy he would leave behind. It was a gesture of rehabilitation that came too late for Robert to fully enjoy. But it showed that the country was finally ready to acknowledge what he had contributed and how badly he had been treated during the security hearing. He did not express bitterness about the years of exile or anger toward those who had destroyed his career. Instead, he spoke about the hope that science could be used to benefit all humanity and the importance of international cooperation in solving the world's problems. Even before the Manhattan Project, he had done important work in theoretical physics that helped scientists understand stars, black holes, and the fundamental forces of nature. His early research on neutron stars and gravitational collapse was decades ahead of its time and would later help astronomers understand some of the most mysterious objects in the universe. In just 3 years, he had managed to bring together the greatest collection of scientific talent in history and focus their efforts on a single, impossible goal. Under his leadership, they had turned abstract theories about atoms into working weapons that ended a world war. No scientific project before or since had achieved so much so quickly. But around the world, newspapers and magazines published long articles about Robert's life and achievements. But they had also killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they had started an arms race that brought humanity to the edge of total destruction during the Cold War. Scientists, politicians, and ordinary people tried to make sense of a man who had been both hero and villain, creator and destroyer, patriot and outcast. The anti-war movement of the 1960s saw him as a prophet who had warned about the dangers of military technology. Environmentalists admired his calls for scientists to consider the consequences of their research. Scientists around the world looked to his example when they faced difficult choices about whether to work on weapons projects or other morally questionable research. His idea that scientists had special responsibilities to society became widely accepted in universities and research institutions everywhere. Civil rights activists saw his persecution as an example of how the government could destroy innocent people who held unpopular opinions. The development of genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, climate science raised questions about the moral responsibilities of researchers that were similar to those Robert had grappled with after creating the atomic bomb. Many of them turned to his writings and speeches for guidance about how to navigate these difficult issues. The laboratory continued to exist long after his death, working on new weapons and other secret projects. But it also became a museum where visitors could learn about the Manhattan Project, think about its implications for humanity. He had been a brilliant scientist who advanced human knowledge in important ways. He had been a patriotic American who helped his country win the most important war in history. His life and work had shown that every great discovery could be used for good or evil, and that scientists could not escape the consequences of their research by claiming to be politically neutral. And the words that came to Robert as he watched that terrible beauty unfold still echo across the decades. "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." It was a legacy that no one would ever be able to escape or forget. He had been a moral voice who warned about the dangers of the very weapons he had created. And he had been a victim of political persecution who showed the importance of protecting individual rights, even in times of national crisis. Books, movies, and television programs told and retold the story of the brilliant scientist who had helped win a war and then been destroyed by the very government he had served. Each generation seemed to find new meaning in his life and new lessons to learn from his experiences. He was proud of the scientific achievement that the Manhattan Project represented, but he was haunted by the human cost of his creation. In his later years, he often spoke about how scientists had gained the knowledge of good and evil. Like Adam and Eve in the biblical story, once they had tasted this fruit, there was no way to return to innocence. His rise and fall showed how quickly a hero could become a villain when political winds changed. It demonstrated the importance of protecting scientific freedom and the danger of allowing fear to overcome reason in making decisions about national security. Just a few months before his death, President Lyndon Johnson had awarded Robert the Enrico Fermi Prize, the highest honor that the American government could give to a scientist, free from the constraints of security clearances and political pressure. He had been able to speak honestly about the moral implications of nuclear weapons and the responsibilities of scientists. His warnings about the dangers of the arms race and his calls for international cooperation had influenced a generation of scientists and policymakers. To many people, he represented the conflict between scientific freedom and government control, between individual conscience and national security. His persecution during the McCarthy era showed how fear and suspicion could destroy even the most loyal and accomplished citizens. When Robert received the award, he was too sick to attend the ceremony in person. But in his written acceptance speech, he chose his words carefully. The funeral was small and private, attended only by close family and friends. Robert's scientific contributions were extraordinary and would last forever. But it was his role in the Manhattan Project that made Robert famous and controversial. Yet the atomic bomb was a double-edged legacy. The weapons that Robert helped create had saved lives by ending World War II without a costly invasion of Japan. Robert himself had struggled with this contradiction for the rest of his life. The security hearing of 1954 had made Robert a symbol of something larger than his own personal tragedy. But Robert's exile from government service had also given him a unique voice in American society. In the years after Robert's death, his reputation continued to grow. Robert's influence extended far beyond America. The story of Robert's life also became a cautionary tale about the relationship between science and politics. As the decades passed after Robert's death, new generations of scientists faced challenges that he could never have imagined. Robert's personal story also continued to fascinate people around the world. The place where Robert had achieved his greatest triumph, Los Alamos, became a symbol of both human achievement and human folly. In the end, Robert Oppenheimer's legacy was as complicated as the man himself. But perhaps most importantly, Robert had forced humanity to confront fundamental questions about the relationship between knowledge and power, between scientific achievement and moral responsibility. The mushroom cloud that rose over Trinity on that July morning in 1945 cast a shadow that still falls across the world today.